This is Emily Davenport over here with the AMC in the White Mountains, and I'm here to talk a little bit more in depth about Leave No Trace. And it's a Center for Outdoor Ethics, and it's a great organization and nonprofit that does a lot of work with educating people who are recreating in the outdoors and teaching people really how to recreate in an ethical way with minimal impact, and also they try to foster that ethic in people. So definitely Leave No Trace is not a hard and fast set of rules, which they will continually remind you of, but it is kind of an organization that really wants to promote this discussion and this thought and this ethic of how to recreate responsibly in the outdoors, because they are aware that more and more people are going outside and recreating, and of course the places we love and are going to are being impacted by this. This is exactly what we've been talking about in this class so far. It's what Guy and Laura Waterman talk a lot about in their book. Aldo Leopold mentions it as well, this need for a land ethic. And so Leave No Trace, this organization, is kind of the gold standard and best practice for using practical techniques to address all these things we've been talking about. So I'll talk more in depth about kind of the background of the Leave No Trace program and organization, and then talk more in depth about the 7 principles of Leave No Trace that they try to educate people on. So the Leave No Trace mission is to protect the outdoors by teaching and inspiring people to enjoy it responsibly. So like I said, they are very aware that more and more people are recreating in the outdoors, and they want to give you practical ways of doing that, and ways that we can recreate and not hurt the areas we're going to. That's just kind of the cut and dry version of it. But they do a lot of research, like science-based research and data collection, even studying human behaviors to kind of come up with these principles and these best practices for the areas that we are going to. I will say some of these slides don't really pertain to us. This is kind of a lengthy slideshow, but I'll try to keep it to what pertains to us. But yeah, so they're really mainly looking at impacts. There's a lot of impacts that come from outdoor recreation, and so the main ones that they kind of focus on are the wildlife impacts. So how is wildlife being harmed in all the various ways by our presence out in the backcountry, how are soils affected. So like here in the White Mountains, we have a lot of trail erosion just from the sheer numbers of people coming out here. So that's kind of a huge thing. They're also looking at vegetation, cultural resources, campfires. Campfires is a huge one. It has its own principle all on its own because it has a huge impact on wild areas, and not so much out here in the east, but definitely out west. You see campfires associated obviously with wildfires and destroying huge swaths of forest. So there's a ton of impacts from outdoor recreation and stuff. We've been talking about it for a couple weeks now. And then of course water resources, and then other visitors. So kind of like what we've been talking about with the wilderness, the idea of wilderness and how that's affected as well from our presence here in our favorite outdoor spaces. I thought this was a really telling graph that I believe is pretty current from Leave No Trace. They came out with these numbers. And so this shows the visits per year and hundreds of millions of people. And it shows, how many people are using the Forest Service lands, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. And we talk a lot about these federal lands, but then you look over at the state park system and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people going to the state parks. So this is just kind of a great visual to see that, yes, outdoor recreation is a huge thing in the States right now. And it's growing a lot in popularity. It's been growing ever since the 1960s, really. So yeah, with those numbers, the lands are really sure to be affected. So this is kind of the population they're trying to reach with this program. So this is kind of their their way of illustrating, like, look at this pretty river and this wonderful field, and how would you feel, if you're sitting here alone in this space? But then, more and more people show up to picnic, and everyone's having a good time. It's great, but your experience does change, and it does impact the area itself. So now we're seeing trash left behind, bare bits of grass. So that's just kind of an illustration from Leave No Trace. And we've all probably seen it in our favorite spaces as well. So Leave No Trace is really big on the spectrum. So they really know that not everyone's going to be perfect with how they recreate in a minimal way outside. They know most people aren't out to just intentionally harm the environment. It's not like we're going out and just throwing out our trash everywhere. Granted, some people probably do that, but the average American person is not trying to go out and intentionally harm people, but a lot of people just don't know what impacts they are having on these spaces. So they're aware that, like, somewhere along the spectrum people line up. And so the idea is that they want people to find where they are in the spectrum, and with this education, start pushing their way back towards fewer and fewer impacts. And again, knowing that we're not going to be perfect with how we recreate, that's a good thing to strive for. But just creating an awareness of where we are on the spectrum with, are we having few impacts? Are we having significant impacts? And then again, trying to be better about all of that. Like I mentioned earlier, it is science-based and data-driven. So they do a really good job of, backing up all of these suggestions of principles with empirical data and a lot of research and study. And they actually do study a lot about human behavior as well, which is a huge part of this. How, I saw this as a great example on Franconia Ridge for a long time. So we have an issue out here in the Whites with people wanting to hike off trail, and they trample alpine vegetation, which the alpine vegetation here is very rare. Some of it is extremely rare. They can only find it here in the Whites, or about 300 miles north in the Arctic tundra. But footsteps really affect these alpine plants, and so they definitely want everyone to stay on trail when they get to the alpine. Well, they were noticing on Franconia Ridge that so many people were stepping off trail, and so they started building up what we call scree walls, so walls made of more of rock, but people were still stepping over it. And some people even suggested, hey, maybe we need to do handrails, because humans will stay in a handrail if a handrail is up. And then, of course, other people were against that because that affects, the look of the place and the feeling of wilderness and being out in the wild. So again, it is that question of, how much do you try to affect human behavior, and how much are you ruining of this wilderness experience? So again, this is all very gray area and not black and white, but it is interesting how it is a lot based on human behavior and how we interact with these spaces. So these are the main principles, and I'm sorry, this bar at the bottom is kind of in the way. Oops. So yeah, these are the 7 principles, and I will say you can get into all of these in way more detail. Leave No Trace has multiple training courses, so you can do an hour-long training course. I incorporate Leave No Trace a lot of times in the work I do here at the AMC as a guide. I kind of informally teach people, in little ways here and there for all of this. But you can sit down and take a course with Leave No Trace, where you do a 2-day course, and they also have up to a 5-day course where you're out and talking about all of these principles. And each of these principles could be an hour-long or more lesson with interactive activities, and it's very hands-on learning. And so right now, this is kind of the crash course of it. Like I said, you can go into way more detail on all of these and have a ton of discussion on all of these, because it's not, like I said, it's not black and white, but so I'll just give you a good introduction of all of them. The first principle is plan ahead and prepare. And this is kind of a baseline principle. If you don't really understand where you're going and how you're wanting to kind of recreate in that area, then you can't do a good job of minimizing your impacts. For example, like if you are wanting to go to a wilderness area here in the White Mountains with 15 of your friends, first off, that's not allowed in the wilderness area, but it's like what Guy and Laura Waterman were talking about, is that ethical to have groups more than 10? And at least with the wilderness areas, you're not allowed to. So that's kind of one example of how you'd want to plan ahead and prepare. And I should also mention here too, where you're going regionally matters as well. And so if you're going out to the desert, there's going to be different practices that you'd want to adopt that differ from out here in the Northeast. And so Leave No Trace does have different curriculum based on the region that you're recreating in. So I think that's really great that they are acknowledging that now, are acknowledging that these regions, these landscapes are different in what they need. So that really can influence how you plan ahead and prepare. And also this just incorporates anything you want to plan ahead and prepare for when it comes to going outside. So making sure you have the right clothes, map, compass, all of those things. Because if you don't have any of those, then you're not going to be able to recreate in a very minimal way, if that makes sense. The next one is travel and camp on durable surfaces. This is a really important one, understanding what is a durable surface. And so a durable surface would be rock. Snow is actually a durable surface. So camping on snow and traveling through snow, the snow is going to disappear. You're not hurting that ground underneath usually. So snow is considered a durable surface. Walking, being able to walk through mud in the middle of a trail and not walking around that mud, and so you don't widen out that trail. Basically, traveling on those surfaces that won't be as impacted by your footsteps, and not walking on rock and not walking on the delicate moss in the woods. And like I said, we have some pretty rare unique plants out here in the Northeast, and so you don't want to trample on those. Disposing of waste properly. This is a really extensive one, and a lot of people go right towards how you're disposing of your human waste and also pet waste. But it also, if you are camping, it also applies to how you're disposing of your food bits, how you're disposing of your toothpaste when you're brushing your teeth, your gray water when you're cooking, pretty much anything that you are trying to get rid of. How are you disposing of that? Are you carrying it out? Is it okay to scatter your coffee grounds, or do you carry your coffee grounds out? All of those things are under dispose of waste properly. This principle used to be more like pack it in, pack it out, but they realized that a lot of people do. It's not a matter of just simply taking out your trash that you brought in. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and so that's what dispose of waste properly kind of talks about. So like here in the Northeast, it's digging a proper cat hole. If you do go number 2 out in the woods, out west, that means you don't even dig a cat hole, because that landscape is really, really fragile. So you want to pack out everything. So that's when you would bring what we call a wag bag, and you would poop in a bag and carry your own poop out. So again, it's knowing those regional differences, and it's just trying to dispose of that waste properly. The next one is leave what you find. Leave No Trace recognizes that it's kind of this human thing that we want to collect things. It's this interesting thing where we have these memories, and you want to take something with you to remind you of that. And you find a pretty leaf or a pretty rock, and you want to keep that. and take that. And definitely that is something that people struggle with. I have a friend that took a barrel cactus from Joshua Tree National Park, which is, yeah, a whole barrel cactus. But he feels bad about that now. But yeah, basically leaving what you find, not harming the habitat of the wildlife and all of those things. And also invasive species, that can be an issue with if you're taking things like here in the Northeast, we have a thing of not taking firewood over state lines, and that's to kind of control invasive species. So that's kind of along those lines is what Leave What You Find is talking about. Minimize campfire impacts is the next one. And like I mentioned before, campfires have a huge impact on recreation. And so this principle kind of talks about if you do need to use a fire, how to do it in a very minimal way. But really, a lot of this is basically don't use a campfire if you don't have to. And it's using, a lot of people talk about in this principle whether you should destroy fire rings that you come across in the woods, or if you just want to use established fire rings that you come across and leave the impact to one specific area instead of spreading it out and making new campfires. So that's kind of what this principle talks about. The next one is respect wildlife. So it's kind of an obvious one, don't feed the bears, don't try to pet the moose. They have a lot of valuable energy that they are trying to store up for fall and winter in the colder months when they are not guaranteed food or shelter. We know when we recreate, we are going to go back to a warm house and have food on the table. But other animals don't. And so even us just simply being in a space where there's wildlife can really, really disrupt their energy levels and what they're trying to do. And they really disrupt their habitat. And the last one, be considerate of other visitors. This one is one that kind of Guy and Laura Waterman talk a lot about in our reading about, hey, maybe don't be a loud, noisy group that's upsetting other groups. I've seen it a lot with people hiking on the trail and listening to their music out loud. That's not being very considerate of other visitors. So things like that, with just being aware that other people are in these spaces as well. And we should be cognizant of that and try to help maintain that wilderness experience for other people that are in here. So that is the very quick version of the 7 principles. And like I said, you can go into way more detail with all of them, of course. And this is just kind of more info on Leave No Trace. Here's kind of a timeline. I will say, it is kind of a really remarkable thing and an unprecedented thing that all of the land agencies back in the 60s and 70s, so yeah, the Wilderness Act, to put this in perspective, was signed in 1964. And in the 1970s, they started, the U.S. Forest Service started putting out a program. All of the agencies kind of had their own program to cope with this rising visitor use. And by the 1990s, they all kind of signed this into, they all adopted this Leave No Trace curriculum in partnership with NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School. But it was unprecedented that even with all the different federal land management agencies and all their different missions and goals, this was the one thing they agreed on, was that, hey, we need to address this. Visitor use is up, and we're seeing an impact. We're seeing a remarkable impact from the amount of people visiting these spaces, even back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So they adopted it in the 1990s as kind of the gold standard. And the organization was established on its own as a nonprofit. And now we have a ton of volunteers, trained partners, and things like that. So it's really, really a far-reaching organization. So pretty much any guide service, outdoor program, outdoor school, any major outdoor company, they all agree on Leave No Trace, which is a pretty remarkable thing. This is kind of different ways that Leave No Trace meets people and reaches people And again, you can find a lot of this on it's called lnt.org is their website, and they have a ton of resources if you want to look into how you can get involved. It's really great. So I'll kind of flip through here quick right now. And like I said, they have different trainings. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'll end it right now. Other things to note before I head out here. Like I said, it is kind of the gold standard and best practice of, training people on actual practical techniques in recreating in the outdoors. And it does a lot with providing, productive discussions for people to kind of establish a land ethic and start really thinking about their choices and their decisions when recreating outside. So I think that's, kind of an awful lot about like what Leopold talks about is building up this ethic. And it's kind of a major goal here with Leave No Trace. Again, it's not hard and fast rules, but they, really want you to think about what you're doing. I also want to note that this is a very Western view of recreating and interacting with public lands. And so I want to also acknowledge the history of how these lands were named public and also how LNT is right now, I feel like in the flux of trying to account for different races, cultures, religions, and how they interact, how different people groups interact with the outdoors, and also Indigenous nations history here, and how, you look at Indigenous nation history and see how people interacted with the outdoors there, and how it isn't so black and white, like we're not going to have any impact because they lived more sustainably within the land. And so, again, that's more than what I'm going to get into here, but it's just something to note for maybe future discussion in this class of how this is one way of looking at how you're interacting with the outdoors. And most people, like I said, do support Leave No Trace, but you have some critics that say that these Leave No Trace principles get us kind of separated from the outdoors in a way, and that's not good either. So again, there's multiple sides of all of this that we can talk more about in this class, but just wanted to throw that out there at the end. But yeah, if you have any questions about Leave No Trace, like I said, I teach it all the time with the groups that I come through and guide here at the AMC. But if you have any questions about Leave No Trace, how to get involved, learn more about it, please shoot me an email, or you can look up more things on the LNT website. Yeah, thanks everyone for watching.